What if one of the most famous borders in the modern Middle East was never actually drawn the way the story says it was? In June 2014, after ISIS captured Mosul, the group released an English-language propaganda film called The End of Sykes-Picot. It showed a bulldozer tearing through an earthen berm on the Iraq-Syria frontier. The message was simple. This border was artificial, foreign-made, and finished. A decade later, the phrase came back from a completely different direction. In May 2025, U.S. Envoy Tom Barrack described Sykes-Picot as part of a century-old system of foreign maps, mandates, and rule imposed on the region. He wrote that the mistake had cost generations and said Washington would not repeat it. That comparison is almost too neat. A jihadist movement trying to erase the state system, and an American diplomat talking about the failure of Western-imposed borders, both reaching for the same historical name. But here is where I think the usual Sykes-Picot story goes wrong. The agreement did not simply draw the borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, or Israel in one afternoon. The map that Sykes and Picot negotiated in 1916 was not the map we live with today. Much of it was later changed, renegotiated, or discarded. So why does the name still carry so much weight? Because the real story is not just about where a line was drawn. It is about who had the power to decide where the lines should be drawn at all. To understand that, we have to go back to 1915, while the First World War was still undecided. The Ottoman Empire controlled most of the Arab provinces that Britain and France were already planning to take from it. Britain wanted the Ottoman Empire weakened. It also wanted Arab support behind the Ottoman front. So British officials opened a channel to Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Hashemite ruler of Mecca. The British representative was Sir Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner in Egypt. Hussein wanted something enormous in return: independence for the Arabs after the war. Not a token concession. He was imagining an Arab state, or confederation of Arab states, across much of the Arabian Peninsula and the Fertile Crescent. On October 24, 1915, McMahon answered with language that sounded promising but was carefully qualified. Britain said it was prepared to recognize and support Arab independence in the territories Hussein had asked about, while excluding certain areas along the Mediterranean. And that is the first complication. Palestine was not named plainly in the exchange. Hussein and later Arab leaders understood the correspondence as covering Palestine. The British government later argued that the wording excluded it. That dispute is still debated because the language itself is ambiguous. And ambiguity, in imperial diplomacy, can be a useful thing. Hussein heard a promise of independence. Britain heard a promise that still left room for maneuver. The Arab Revolt began in 1916. Arab forces fought the Ottomans alongside the British, and the revolt became a central part of the Allied campaign in the Hejaz and the Levant. This is the point where the story usually turns into a morality tale. Britain promised independence. Britain betrayed the Arabs, then drew a colonial map. There is truth in that story, but it is still incomplete. Because while Britain was negotiating with Hussein, British and French officials were already negotiating something else. Starting in late 1915, Sir Mark Sykes, a British politician with an intense interest in the Ottoman East, negotiated with the French diplomat François-Georges Picot. Their task was blunt: work out what Britain and France wanted to control if the Ottoman Empire collapsed. They negotiated through the winter. The resulting agreement was accepted in May 1916. And here the famous image appears: two men, a map, and a line across the Middle East. It is a great image. It is also misleading if we take it literally. The agreement was not a simple partition into today's countries. It describes zones of direct and indirect control, areas assigned to French and British influence, a proposed Arab state or confederation in other areas, and an international administration for Palestine. That last detail matters. The original agreement did not simply hand Palestine to Britain. It proposed an international administration for the area because its religious and strategic importance made a clean British or French settlement difficult. And the oil question mattered too, especially in Mesopotamia. Mosul would become one of the most strategically valuable parts of the entire dispute. So yes, Sykes-Picot was an imperial bargain. Britain and France were negotiating spheres of influence over lands they did not govern democratically and whose populations had not been consulted as equals. But no, this was not a finalized blueprint for every modern border. I want to pause on that distinction because it changes the whole story. The myth says Sykes and Picot sat in a room and drew Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and everything else. The historical reality is messier. They sketched an imperial arrangement. Then the war ended. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Russia changed sides politically. Arab armies made their own claims. Britain and France argued with each other. Local revolts changed the facts on the ground, and a series of post-war conferences rewrote the map. The line mattered, but the process mattered more. Then Britain made another commitment. On November 2, 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration also said that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This was not the same kind of document as the McMahon Correspondence. It was not a promise of a sovereign Jewish state. It was a British policy declaration with carefully chosen language. But to people living in Palestine, the political consequences were not abstract. The same territory was now being discussed through competing promises, competing national projects, and competing understandings of who had the right to determine its future. This is why the phrase, "the thrice-promised land," is so powerful as a storytelling device. But it should not be taken as if three identical legal promises were handed to three parties. The three commitments were different. Their wording, purpose, and legal status were different. What they shared was a territory and a British government trying to satisfy several conflicting strategic goals at the same time. And eventually, those promises collided. In late 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. They also wanted to expose the old imperial system they had just overthrown. Among the secret diplomatic documents they published was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. For Arab nationalists, the revelation was devastating. Many Arab leaders and fighters had been cooperating with Britain on the assumption that independence was possible after victory. Now they could see that Britain and France had privately been planning a post-Ottoman order of their own. The issue was not simply betrayal in the emotional sense. It was credibility. If Britain had promised independence while negotiating imperial control, what exactly was a wartime promise worth? And that question would survive the agreement itself. After the war, Sykes-Picot did not simply become reality. The Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Sèvres, the rise of Turkish nationalism, the French war in Syria, British policy in Iraq and Palestine, and further negotiations all changed the settlement. Then came San Remo in April 1920. The Allied powers decided that the former Ottoman Arab territories would be administered through League of Nations mandates. Britain received the mandates for Palestine and Mesopotamia. France received the mandates for Syria and Lebanon. That is a crucial moment because it tells us where the modern story really begins to solidify. Sykes-Picot was secret wartime planning. The mandate system was a new international legal framework shaped by the victors after the war. And even then, the borders were not finished. The final boundaries of states, such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, emerged through additional negotiations, military campaigns, treaties, and compromises over the following years. The Mosul question is a good example. Britain wanted Mosul within Iraq. France had earlier expected a sphere of influence that touched the area. The dispute was eventually resolved in a way that left Mosul in Iraq, with France receiving a share of Iraqi oil interests. So if someone tells you that the modern Middle East was drawn in one room in 1916, the best response is, not quite. The more uncomfortable answer is that the map kept being redrawn by a series of rooms, conferences, and military victories, mostly controlled by outside powers, and rarely with equal participation by the people who would actually live inside those borders. And this is the part I think is worth slowing down for. The problem with the popular Sykes-Picot story is not that it is too critical of empire. The problem is that it can be too simple. It can make it sound as though the Middle East was once a collection of perfectly natural, harmonious communities, and then two Europeans walked in with a ruler and destroyed all of it. History was not that clean. The Ottoman provinces contained cities, tribes, religious communities, linguistic groups, commercial networks, and political rivalries that did not line up neatly with modern nationalism. Sectarian conflict, ethnic competition, and political violence also existed before 1916. At the same time, it would be equally misleading to swing to the opposite extreme and say the borders did not matter because local conflicts already existed. They mattered enormously. New states created new political institutions. New rulers inherited armies and bureaucracies. Minorities became minorities inside new states. Trade routes and administrative centers were reorganized. European powers retained military and economic leverage, and nationalist movements had to operate inside boundaries they had not designed. So the strongest version of the argument is not, Europe invented every problem. It is, external powers helped build a political order in which local actors then had to compete, govern, rebel, and survive. That is harder to turn into a slogan. It is also much closer to the evidence. Now we can go back to 2014. When ISIS released The End of Sykes-Picot, it wanted the audience to believe that the modern state system itself was an artificial Western construction, and that the group was restoring a political order that should replace it. There was one obvious problem with the symbolism. The physical berm shown in the propaganda film was not a literal piece of the 1916 Sykes-Picot map. The actual border infrastructure was built decades later, after the original agreement had already ceased to function as a practical blueprint. But propaganda does not need cartographic precision. It needs a symbol people understand. For ISIS, Sykes-Picot meant the entire post-Ottoman state system, Iraq, Syria, and the borders between them. The name stood for a century of foreign intervention in one word. And that is why the symbolism worked even when the map was technically wrong. This is an important distinction. The durability of a border and the durability of a historical myth are not the same thing. The borders survived. The symbol survived, too. Then, in May 2025, Tom Barrack used the same historical reference from almost the opposite political direction. He described Sykes-Picot as part of an era when the West imposed maps, mandates, and foreign rule on the region, and said that mistake had cost generations. It is tempting to say, look, ISIS and Washington now agree about the Middle East. They did not. ISIS wanted to abolish the state system in the name of a transnational caliphate. Barrack was talking about a new regional diplomacy and a rejection of old-style Western intervention. The similarity was narrower and more interesting. Both were treating Sykes-Picot as a symbol of a political order they believed no longer fit the reality of the region. That distinction matters because historical symbols are often portable. The same event can be used by completely different actors for completely different purposes. And the story gets even more complicated because in 2025, Barrack later made remarks suggesting that, in Israel's strategic thinking, the old lines were not necessarily binding when security interests were at stake. Whatever one thinks of those remarks, they reveal the persistence of the same underlying question. When security, territory, and sovereignty collide, whose definition of a border wins? There is another reason the Sykes-Picot myth survives. The people affected by the state system never disappeared from the story. Kurds, Druze, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, Christians, Sunnis, Shiites, Alawites, and many other communities did not all imagine political belonging in the same way. That does not mean every group wanted a separate country. In many cases, people wanted security, autonomy, representation, equal citizenship, or simply the ability to live without being ruled by someone else's militia. But the modern state system forced difficult questions into national containers. Who counts as the state? Who controls the army? Which language is official? Which city is the capital? Who owns the oil? Who has a veto? Who guarantees the minority that the majority will not simply take everything? Those are not questions two European diplomats could solve with a pencil in 1916. And they are not questions that disappear because we redraw a line today. When Bashar al-Assad's government collapsed in December 2024, the old question returned in a new form. Syria entered a transitional period under Ahmed al-Sharaa, with competing pressures over central authority, local autonomy, minority security, Kurdish self-rule, foreign intervention, and the country's relationship with Israel, Turkey, Iran, the Gulf states, and the United States. Notice what is striking here. Nobody needed to literally reopen a map from 1916 for the underlying problem to reappear. A century later, Syria was still wrestling with the same category of question. Who gets to decide the shape of the political order, and how much of that decision belongs to outsiders? That does not mean Syria in 2025 or 2026 is a simple replay of 1916. It is not. The actors are different. The technologies are different. The ideological landscape is different. But the structural argument is familiar. Borders can exist on paper, while the political bargain underneath them remains unsettled. And then there is Iran. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran. The war that followed became a major regional conflict, with Iranian retaliation against Israel, U.S. forces and regional targets, severe disruption to the Gulf security environment, and a prolonged political crisis. By August 25, 2026, there was still no durable peace settlement. The conflict had moved through pauses, negotiations, and renewed pressure without resolving the larger confrontation. Now, this is where a History Channel can easily go wrong. It would be tempting to say, Sykes-Picot caused the 2026 war. It did not. The Iran conflict has its own causes: Iran's nuclear program, decades of U.S.-Iran hostility, Israeli security doctrine, proxy networks, regional power competition, missile warfare, and the consequences of years of escalation. Those are modern causes. They cannot honestly be reduced to a map from the First World War. But the conflict is still useful for the larger question of this documentary. Because once again, the Middle East is being shaped not only by people who live there, but by external powers projecting military force, diplomatic pressure, and security arrangements across borders. That is the connection. Not causation, pattern. So, did two men in a room draw the Middle East? Not really. And I think that makes the story more interesting, not less. Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot did negotiate a secret imperial arrangement in 1916. That arrangement mattered. It revealed what Britain and France intended to do with Ottoman Arab territories if they won. But the modern borders were produced later, through wartime outcomes, the mandate system, conferences, treaties, military campaigns, negotiations over oil, and local resistance. The famous line was not destiny. The people with the power to keep revising the map were the real story. That is why blaming everything on Sykes-Picot misses the point. The agreement was not a magic spell that caused every war in the Middle East. It was evidence of something more basic: the assumption that great powers could design a regional order first, and that the people living inside it would have to negotiate with the consequences afterward. 100 years later, the exact line from the Sykes-Picot map is less important than the political habit it represented. A government falls, a foreign army arrives, a militia controls a road, a minority demands autonomy, a great power guarantees one side's security, another power rejects the settlement. A border is declared permanent until someone strong enough decides it is not. The map can change, the names can change, the flags can change. But the question keeps coming back: who gets to decide? That is why Sykes-Picot is still alive as a political symbol, even though its original map is not the map of the modern Middle East. ISIS used the name because it wanted to erase the post-Ottoman state system. American officials have used the name because they wanted to signal that the old era of Western intervention had failed. Regional actors invoke it when they want to explain foreign interference, broken promises, or the artificiality of borders. And historians keep returning to it because the agreement exposes something uncomfortable about international politics. Borders may look permanent on a map, while the legitimacy beneath them remains contested for generations. So perhaps the real legacy of Sykes and Picot is not the line they drew. It is the idea that a few powerful governments could sit in a room and decide what a whole region should become. And that is the part of the story that never really ended. When I first came back to the Sykes-Picot story, the obvious image was the one everyone knows. Two men leaning over a map, drawing a line through somebody else's home. The more I looked at it, the less satisfied I was with that version. Because the line itself was never the whole story. The harder question is what happened after the line. Who inherited the power to redraw it? Who had to live with it? And who was allowed to say no? That is why I would not tell this story as two men created the Middle East. I would tell it as something more unsettling. Two men showed the world who believed they had the right to create it. And a century later, the argument over that right is still unfinished.